Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. And as my casual streams are still sort of new here, I'm going to reiterate the format a little bit. So for the next 45 minutes roughly, I'll discuss the topic at hand. And then for the last 15 minutes, I'll devote time to interacting with the chat. If you want to make sure that I get to what you say, do it as a super chat. And any over and above that, I'll try to get to in the allotted time. The other thing is, I also need a little bit of help with supers. There's a minimum threshold below which the money won't be transferred to you yet. I'm about 2/3 of the way to that threshold. So for the supers that I already have, I haven't actually have it transferred to my account yet until we reach that minimum threshold that AdSense has. So that would be much appreciated as well. Don't forget to also check out my locals. You can subscribe to my locals. You can support me there. And you can also interact with the channel to make recommendations for future topics for example, the casual stream or future roundtable discussions or any number of things. I also see that we've already got Big Brain in here, Big Brain Contact. Yes, thank you. Minoan, I see you're already here. Thanks again. So we're just sort of going to wait a little bit for more people to come in. As a sort of like light introduction to this, the sort of hawk-dove debate, or discussion rather, goes to 1973, John Maynard Smith and George Price, who were biologists, decided to quantify the competition for resources. Hawk means you're aggressive, you fight. Dove means you don't fight, you give ground. And so if two doves in their simulation, if two doves meet, then each of them gets basically a 50-50 split of the resources. If a dove meets a hawk, the hawk gets all the resources, and then the dove gets nothing. If two hawks meet, they injure each other as well as gain resources. And so with this kind of simulation, it's trying to figure out what's the most rational choice. Because imagine a game of chicken and you're going to crash into each other. If you both crash, then you both lose big. But that's why it's called Game of Chicken, because somebody's going to fold, but you don't know who. And then more broadly speaking, hawk and dove has been applied to both interpersonal relationship disputes and also geopolitical disputes between nations. And so amongst, say, for example, realists and the right in general in the United States, which tends to pride itself on being pragmatic, both normie right to extreme right, well, they would say that, well, if we look at this is just utopian fantasy, the dove policy. They might make exceptions because America has a practice of religious tolerance and freedom of conscience that will, if you have some religious motivation, like say the Amish, or some philosophical motivation, like a soft-hearted liberal, well, that's one thing, and we'll sort of tolerate you and pat you on the head, et cetera, et cetera. But, for those of us in the real world, we can't do that. That's just ridiculous. We'll tolerate you because we're good people, but otherwise, in the real world, you got to be a hawk. And now, what I'm trying to make the case for tonight is that being a dove is in a sense rational. It's not just a utopian belief that you can ascribe to some sort of religious or philosophical prior commitments. So the first thing I want to start with is if we look at, say, Sun Tzu. You might think that's an odd place to start. Sun Tzu is writing about warfare. How does that work with a dove? Well, in book 3, we read, and I quote, "Hence to fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting." Now, let's unpack this a little bit, right? One can construe war as the attempt to use force to get somebody to change their thoughts and or actions to be in alignment with yourself. Now, that's by using force as the means to do so. Diplomacy could be seen as, through the art of persuasion and negotiation, achieving the same goal. So you get somebody to agree with you, to act in accordance with your own wishes by using diplomacy. So one way I think you can look at this statement, to win without fighting, is, are you actually winning? Are you actually convincing them to change their behavior without a direct recourse to what today in the modern U.S. military parlance would be a force-on-force conflict? The other thing you could look at this as well as, well, to my knowledge, it's entirely apocryphal, but it seems to be the truth underneath this statement is true regardless of its attribution. It's been attributed to Abraham Lincoln that when he was, I think it was when he was being accused of being soft on the South during Reconstruction or in the lead up to Reconstruction, that he says, have I not conquered my enemies if I have made them my friend? Now, whether Lincoln actually said that or not is really not important. What's important is the intention conveyed by the statement. And the statement to me seems pretty clear that there's this understanding in ethics and interpersonal relationships that is the preferable way to get people to align with your interests. Now, that doesn't mean you always do that, but it does mean that seems to be an underlying preference. Now, what I would want to argue is that the reason why we don't see a lot of successful dove policies was one of two things. One, we're not really looking in the right parts of the historical record to find them. But then also, two, it's actually very hard. And so rather than the sort of like cowardly portrayal or cop-out attitude of a dove strategy, like we might see with Eustace in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, avoiding a duel with Reepicheep for provoking a fight, sort of coward's ploy, it's actually extremely difficult. And it takes a great amount of self-mastery in order to pull it off. So to also quote Sun Tzu, and I quote, "Hence the saying, if you know your enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself and not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle." Okay, so we already know that the highest, these are both from chapter 3, that we know that Sun Tzu says the highest goal is to win without fighting. And, now you need not fear the result of 100 battles if you know yourself and know your enemy. But what I think you can deduce from this is that by knowing yourself and knowing your enemy, you have achieved one of the preconditions to win without fighting, which would be at its highest form an expression of the dove strategy. Now, that's hard, right? I mean, for example, the Greek philosophers, with Socrates began with the statement, "Know thyself," because they would argue that true knowledge comes from self-knowledge. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do. And if you read the Platonic dialogues, you read that one of Socrates' problems is he can't find people that have self-knowledge, or more to the point, people that are equipped to begin the long journey of discovering self-knowledge. And that's not even beginning to discuss knowledge of other people, specifically people you would consider your enemies. So we see that this is a pretty high bar regardless, which would also limit the amount of actors in this particular strategy. But I think you can make a case that knowing yourself and knowing your enemy is a precondition to winning without fighting, and winning without fighting is the highest stage of war. So that's one thing. Another Chinese sage, Lao Tzu, and I'm quoting from the 1891 translation, chapter 36, and I quote, "When one is about to take an inspiration, he is sure to make a previous expiration. When he is going to weaken another, he will first strengthen him. When he is going to overthrow another, he will first have raised him up. When he is going to despoil another, he will first have made gifts to him. This is called hiding the light of his procedure. The soft overcomes the hard and the weak the strong. Fishes should not be taken from the deep. The instruments for profit of state should not be shown to the people." Now, the key thing here I want to focus on is the soft overcomes the hard. Now, the dove would be perceived as soft, and the hawk would be perceived as hard in this context. And it's like, well, wouldn't the hard win? Well, let's look at something, right? What breaks down and cracks pavement, cement, and bricks? Water and vines. Now, water and vines are soft. Water, as Sun Tzu said, is shapeless and formless. But yet, over time, it cracks even the hardest rocks. Two other examples of soft overcoming hard would be a woman that overcomes a man. That's, soft overcoming hard. And the other one escapes me at the moment. That might come to me later. But as well as this idea of time, the time dimension as well, which Lao Tzu is getting at, we find in the life of Sertorius, we're told by Plutarch that his idea was that while a direct assault on a fortified position might not be sufficient to carry it, small incremental efforts could chip away at this fortified position such that it would break in a context in which it wouldn't otherwise break. So it's time and patience. And so if we have time and patience, and the soft overcoming the hard, then we see that, another good example of the soft overcoming the hard is Kevlar body armor. It's soft and flexible and can bend and absorb the impact, but the hard bullet, doesn't break it, right? The soft contains and disperses the blow, whereas like a single sheet of plate armor would have a hole punched right through it, like we saw in the Renaissance. So having all this tied together, we can sort of develop a sort of theoretical insight that gradual application of certain principles over time lead to even the hardest, most well-ensconced position falling. A good example of this, unfortunately, in our own time, is the left's march to the institutions. The institutions were imposing and strong and powerful in their own day in the 50s, but through subtle moves and subversion were eventually completely taken over. And so we can see in real time how the soft has overcome the hard rather. And so winning without fighting, by being soft and defeating the hard, by knowing yourself and knowing your enemy, and developing this framework for action, I think is a sort of, the first tier here is a sort of theoretical framework and modeling in order to understand this. But the second thing that I'll say is, if we look at Leo Tolstoy, who you could say is a radical dove, in which case he would argue against using force and violence in all circumstances. There was a documentary I watched a few years back from the BBC where the narrator was saying that during his own lifetime and up to his death in 1912, the Russian government feared a revolution from the followers of Tolstoy. Well, in hindsight, they were fearing the wrong revolution. But let's assume that happened. Let's assume, for a thought experiment, that after Tolstoy's death, there was a popular groundswell amongst the Russian people that abolished the state and the standing army. And let's further assume what we could reasonably expect to be a worst-case scenario in the 1914 instead of what actually happened. So let's say Russia, without a government and an army, gets invaded by Germany, Turkey, and Japan. They get occupied or exploited in the form of colonialism, possibly pogroms at the hands of Muslims like Turkey. And, maybe hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Russians die in these invasions. But I think it's a pretty reasonable case could be made, as we saw with Gandhi in India and King in the United States, that a persistent policy of civil disobedience and non-resistance, coupled with appeals to international opinion, could have put pressure on these invaders to eventually withdraw from Russia. Okay, so that's a hypothetical worst-case scenario following Tolstoy's idea. Well, what actually happened in real life? Well, Russia maintained the Tsardom, Russia maintained the army, both of which Tolstoy railed against. They blundered into a world war which killed millions of Russians, which led to a civil war which killed millions of Russians, which led to a communist dictatorship that killed millions of Russians, which led to World War II that killed millions of Russians. So from the death of Tolstoy to the death of Stalin, we had maybe between 60 and 80 million Russians getting killed due to all these causes, directly tied to state action and the Russian army. Now, I don't think anybody could reasonably claim that Russia's fate would have been worse under this hypothetical of Leo Tolstoy. And so comparing this to what actually happened, it seems clear that the hypothetical would be much preferable, despite a worst-case scenario being envisioned. So then that begins to beg the question, is the hawk position really the more rational, the more self-interested one? Furthermore, whatever you want to say about clearly the war in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine is a highly nuanced situation, of which I've discussed at great length in previous episodes of my roundtable and on the Prudentialist. But what I will say, though, is this. Russia's invasion of Ukraine played right into the hands of many of Russia's critics. Sweden and Finland joined NATO. Germany increased its military budget to 100 billion euros. And most of the neighboring countries, except Belarus, hate Russia. The Caucasus hate Russia. Ukraine, the Baltic states hate Russia. Many of the Central Asian republics, and certainly Afghanistan, hate Russia. So it takes no great effort for the U.S. or any other hostile power to organize anti-Russia coalition. Whereas, again, why? Well, the legacy of Tsardom, the legacy of the Soviet Union. Whereas if again, assuming the hypothetical where Tolstoy's vision wins out, it's very unlikely that all of these neighboring nations would hate Russia. In fact, arguably, many of them wouldn't, because Russia wouldn't have invaded them, like Afghanistan or Poland. So I think with that thought experiment, we can see, assuming the most radical hawk position for Russia, the most radical dove position for Russia, and assuming a worst case scenario in the early 20th century, given what we know about the neighboring countries, even that pales into what Russia actually went through. So it would be clear to me, in my mind, that this is a preferable example to follow. And I mean, if Gandhi's efforts in India are anything to go by, it got England to leave. So I don't see why similar activities would not, in conjunction with, say, appeals to the international community, get Russia's neighbors like Japan or Germany to evacuate those positions over enough time. Furthermore, there wouldn't be the massive demographic collapse that Russia is going through. So as of 2021, Russia has lost more people in a given generation, a given year, since the fall of the Soviet Union. And so it is in a terminal spiral of demographic collapse, in part due to the cumulative catastrophes of the 20th century. I think all of which could have been avoided had Russia not actually done this. Now, if we also look at the dove position versus the hawk position, let's say you go up against a super hawk, say Genghis Khan, say the Soviet Union. In many cases, being a hawk yourself would be suicidal. You'd get destroyed. And, the historical record is littered with examples of the Mongol hordes leveling cities to the ground and building pyramids of skulls. But paying tribute, you're spared that. And eventually, most of these societies that paid tribute outlasted the Mongol Empire itself. So there's in those cases, being the dove is the more rational choice. Or, for example, in the collapse of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. Let's look at what was going on there. Right? We'd already seen quote-unquote violent uprisings in East Germany, 1953, Hungary, 1956, Czechoslovakia, kind of a mixed uprising in 1968, none of which were terribly successful. But it was the more nonviolent protesting, again, with significant amount of Western financial aid, that in large part brought down the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. So, for example, Lech Walesa in Poland, if he'd have taken a more militant route, probably wouldn't have achieved the goals that he wanted to. And so, if we look at this, what it seems, a couple things are clear. Against super hawks, I think the historical record shows that the dove strategy is the only viable way to survive, because the pages of history are littered with empires that stood up to the Mongols and were ground into the dust. Whereas those cities that paid them off ended up outlasting the Mongol Empire itself. So that's another thing. And this gets into the time dimension again. It's the life of Sartorius mentions, and also what's mentioned by Lao Tzu, is the idea that you will outlast them. And you do, because these societies did outlast the Mongol Empire. These communities did outlast the Soviet Union. And so if you take into account the time dimension and this broader framework of knowing yourself and knowing your enemy and playing this game of 4D chess, so to speak, you can create conditions by which you can outlast the enemy in a kind of cultural attrition and win. And we see this throughout history. I mean, for example, the classic example of the soft is Christianity itself. And the classic example of the hard are all those people that tried to stamp it out. But where are they? The Roman Empire is in the ash bin of history. The Soviet Union is in the ash bin of history. The Islamic Caliphate. But Christianity is still here. So, playing that long game, I think, is important here. Now, another element to the strategy, and where knowing yourself and knowing your enemy comes in extremely well, is the idea of life in different streams. So, for example, if we read Proverbs 15:17, Solomon says, "Better a small serving of vegetables with love than a fatted calf with hatred." So one of the underlying things Solomon is getting at here is that there's two different ways of life, one in poverty and one in wealth, presumably a king's palace. One is there's you're poor, you're not eating maybe the best tasting meal, but it's a meal where you can sort of relax and enjoy loved ones and not have to worry about being stabbed in the back. Whereas in the king's palace, you might eat delicacies, but you're always looking over your shoulder to see if someone's going to shank you. And so what Solomon is saying here is there's different streams of life. You can be in a different mode of life. And so one of the things that conservatives in a certain sense get right is they'll be like, well, for example, when a woman is in a compromising position, has an unwanted pregnancy, they'll always say, well, how did you get there? Why did you do that? Well, true, but the same goes for a conflict and a fight. How did you get there? Why are you there? They in many ways, conservatives treat getting in fights as carelessly as modern women, getting knocked up without an unplanned pregnancy. Well, you avoid these things by planning ahead. Now, again, this is a somewhat controversial claim, but I would argue that in most cases, more than 90%, conflicts could be avoided if proper planning was taken in order to account for all the variables that are at play and how to come to a mutually agreeable conclusion. Because one of the things that you see even with like the mafia is that persistent long-term violence is bad for business and bad for everything. So one of the things that happened was in the 30s and 40s, Lucky Luciano created an alliance of all the mob bosses to stop the fighting so they could just make money because, fighting's bad for business. And so what you could then see is, well, let's look at that. And so even someone who is, you might say is prone to violence, for example, or known for violence like the mob, or even the Vikings. A good example would be Egil's saga. Egil, you could say, is the hard, and he has a friend, Aaron Bjorn, who's sort of a peacemaker, a sort of diplomat that smooths things over. You can see him as the soft. Egil gets himself in quite a few fixes because of his violent behavior, and Aaron Bjorn is able to get him out by his diplomatic personality and trying to find a middle ground to solve these otherwise irresolvable disputes. And throughout the saga, even though he's clearly not the most martial or aggressive character, he's considered a close friend and ally of Egil, and in that regard is not seen as defective in any way. So, but back to the point is you would want to find a stream of life, a stream of living in which you minimize violence or minimize altercations. So you've chosen a lifestyle. It may be a lifestyle of poverty, like we described in Proverbs 15:17, but you pick a lifestyle in which by living in that lifestyle, you've already minimized your exposure to conflict. Doesn't mean conflict won't arise, but you've minimized your exposure to it. So what that means is you sort of have to imagine, in your mind's eye that life is a series of streams where people are on boats going in different destinations. And some of them have rapids, some of them are lazy, easily navigable rivers. And imagine each lifestyle as it becomes progressively more dangerous, progressively more high risk. The river and the water becomes more treacherous. And you might complain about the treacherousness of the river and the obstacles, but you'd only have yourself to blame because you're on that river. You didn't choose to get into another river or leave that river, which would put you in a less stressful, less dangerous position. And part of that would be, using foresight and prudence to avoid the conflict entirely or to get out of that position entirely. And so what I would say then what somebody might say in response is, well, okay, but per Starship Troopers, right? Like, I think somebody wants to ask Zim, the trainer, well, why do we use a knife? We're living in the age of nukes. And he's like, well, if I pin your hand to the wall with a knife, you can't press the nuclear button. The point being, they might say, well, look, what are you going to do if somebody just comes up and stabs you? What are you going to do there? Well, the first thing is it's assuming you'd be in a situation in which they describe, because, again, in many cases, these hypothetical situations can easily be avoided by foresight. But let's say that you can't avoid it, and then you just, eat the bullet and you bought the farm. I'd argue, so what? Plenty of people die in war. You might land on D-Day and get killed by a machine gun fired from a pillbox. Does that negate the viability of a hawk strategy? Not in the minds of most people. Most people would say, well, there's just casualties in war, bro. Just get used to it. I'm like, okay. Then if this is another strategy, this is just another strategy with casualties. That doesn't invalidate the strategy itself. It just means that, well, okay, some strategies have casualties. But what I would argue is, again, with the Russian thought experiment, It is a strategy that will lead you to having fewer actual casualties. Okay, so in that regard, you can argue it's superior potentially, depending on how it works. Now, I think one of the things that really would behoove. Now, what we see though is I think this strategy is easier at an individual level, and the larger the group you're looking at, the harder it becomes. So I think, especially from some people who live in the United States who are familiar with, or India, who are familiar with pacifist sects like the Amish or the Jainists, or you can see that it's easier for an individual to live like that because they're really only they're only really controlling for their own actions. Whereas if you move up to a larger organized group, like I say, a church or a community or whatever, it becomes a little bit harder because you're controlling for more people. But I think it can still be done because, again, I mentioned the Amish and the Jains and their communities. Now, at the level of a nation, it may be impossible in an absolute sense. But I think in a more moderate sense, this would still be a viable strategy. It would just take a lot of hard work and effort to do it because you have to know yourself and know your enemy. And you have to know a whole bunch of other varieties and conditions. So I think to actually pull this strategy off adequately well, you would actually have to have almost the equivalent of a general staff school. But instead of like learning, say tactics, well, you would be learning tactics, but of a different kind. A lot of the training would focus on self-knowledge and self-mastery first and foremost, so you could know yourself. And also would focus on learning from others, specifically your enemies, because one of the things that tends to happen is people tend to they tend to let their hatred or distaste for their enemy to cloud their judgment. And so they'll play the enemy down, even if it's not justified in doing so, their capacities, their threat ability. And so you would see this sort of education geared towards, sort of sublimating the ego, separate yourself from the judgment here. And also, once you understand who the likely threats are and where they're going to be coming from, you would probably have in-depth cultural studies to see how these people would be negotiated with. Because one of the things that we see throughout history is if you can't communicate with somebody, so communication, language, one of the key reasons why language has developed and been perfected over the centuries is that it provides a very useful, non-violent way to resolve disputes. Because if you can't communicate with somebody over whatever dispute you have, it increases the likelihood of a violent altercation. And so if you can so there's a saying, when people stop talking, they start shooting. And so you need to be able to communicate effectively. And that's not just knowing the language, it's also knowing cultural cues. So there's certain things that you can do within a cultural context that if that can communicate your intended message to the other side in a way even better than language can, and can go a long way in resolving a altercation, and stuff like that would also be focused on. I think you'd also want to focus on looking at the idea of the time dimension. I mean, how long are we talking here, right? For example, from a military context, the Reconquista took 700 years. But it was considered a success. It was a success because it drove the Moors out of Spain. I mean, now again, there were setbacks, and it wasn't always clear that the Christian forces were going to win. But with the same strategy, if we have a long-term, hundreds of years, you may have a lot of setbacks in the short term, and it may look like you're losing. But if you lay it on the right foundation and move forward in the appropriate way, I think it's pretty clear that you can achieve some level of success. Then the other question is, well, what level of success are we talking about? So, for example, for one pursuing a hawk strategy, say total war, like the United States in the Civil War and the United States in World War II, where the enemy is completely prostrate and broken, yeah, that would not be a victory condition of a dove policy. There's no way to enforce that. But I think I would agree with the insight of the Caledonian chieftain Calgacus, who said of the Romans, they create a desert and call it peace. That's I think more or less what you can say to an extreme hawk policy. Same with that Genghis Khan and the Mountains of Skulls. So you'd have to change the definition of what a success would look like. But I think that's not too hard to do. In his biography, our historical biography of Julius Caesar, H.B. Liddell Hart criticizes Caesar's savagery against the Gauls and quotes Montesquieu. And I'm paraphrasing it, something to the effect that the goal of diplomacy is to achieve a resolution where both sides agree to make trade-offs that are in their interest, because nobody's going to get everything they want unless they have overwhelming force and just threaten to just wipe the other guy out. Normally you have to come to some sort of accommodation, which because you have to assume that the other side has interests. And I think that's one of the things that we've seen with an extreme hawk policy, is that we assume that whether it's the Islamic peoples of the Middle East or Russia today, they just don't have legitimate interests that we have to cater to. So, and that's the part because the United States is so wealthy and powerful that we can delude ourselves into thinking that we can just ignore that. But we're beginning to realize that you can't, because we lost in Afghanistan. And I don't hold your breath, but I don't think we're going to do very much better in the new conflicts brewing with Russia and China. So the issue then is, but then again, if you assume that the other side has rational interests and you have rational interests, and then the issue is, well, okay, well, how can we sort of navigate this so that the other side is happy enough with the interests that they have and we're happy enough with ours, and that leads to long-lasting peace over centuries. I think that that's a criteria for victory, for success, and one that's eminently achievable. So the real issue is, how do you do that? A good example, I mean, it's not a perfect example, but it's a sort of historical archetype we could use. If we look at the re-Christianization of Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, contrary to later Catholic conversions like in South America, places like that, or even like Eastern Europe with the Baltic Crusades, we don't really see the use of force because the Catholic Church was in no position to apply force. So we saw with the Irish missionaries coming out of Ireland, first Patrick converted Ireland, a highly warlike society, which was, rooted in slaving and raiding. And then from Ireland, the Scots were converted, and I think it was by Columba. And then St. Aidan went to Northumbria. And then, of course, from the south, the Catholics sent Augustine to Canterbury. So the issue is these again, the quote soft, the monks defeated the hard, these rough and tumble harem-scarem pagans. And we see this with the Vikings themselves from Scandinavia. They were overcome by the Christian missionaries. Now, some were killed, some were martyred, but that's the point, right? In every war, there's casualties. But in the end, there was a successful conversion of the Norse peoples so that they stopped raiding Christian settlements and eventually became allies in the Crusades. So, but it depends, right? If you looked at this at the beginning of the Viking Age or at the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire, you'd say it was a failure. But it's because you're looking at too small of a time frame. You have to extend the scope of the time frame in order to see that it was actually a success. And I think that's another thing we see, which is a defect of the hawk perspective. The hawk perspective tends to compress everything into a very short amount of time. The sort of, what I would say, illusion, promise offered is that you can achieve all of your goals relatively quickly with the use of force. But as we've seen in the 20th century and 21st centuries, and as I've covered on my channel on numerous occasions, each of the conflicts the United States engages in creates the preconditions for the next one. World War I created the preconditions for World War II. World War II created the preconditions for the communist hegemony over Eastern Europe and Asia. And the Cold War, after the Cold War, U.S. expanding NATO into former Warsaw Pact territory is one of the stated reasons why Putin is attacking Ukraine. So each one of these is creating the conditions for the next conflict, which, again, that's not the goal. Even Aristotle himself said war is not an end in itself. And Augustine said one fights war to have peace. So we see that this is not a very effective way, unless I think ultimately U.S. foreign policy is about profiting war profiteers. So it's successful for them because they make a lot of money, and they always need more wars to make money. But from a sort of policy issue, I think this is a failure. I don't think it works. And if we look at that, I think that while this is not a silver bullet that would guarantee total victory in all cases, or maybe even most cases today, I think what you can say though is once properly constructed, properly defined, properly construed, a Dove policy, whether an absolute Tolstoyan perspective or a more, Dove most of the time like Switzerland, is a viable strategy that can achieve many of the goals of, say, resource acquisition, living in peace with each other in ways that the hawk policy, especially in recent years, has seemed to be deficient. And again, one of the things we mentioned going back to Russia, continued military conflicts over time degrade the demographics of the country. We see this with Europe, right? The 2 world wars left Europe extremely degraded demographically and also spiritually, which has led to their death spiral we've been witnessing over the last 60 years. So these are all sorts of externalities that the hawks never consider when they add them into their calculation. And in part because they look at it's too narrow in scope of time, and then too narrow in scope of all relevant variables. So, and to be honest, who's more successful, right? A soldier who died on the beaches of Normandy to defeat the Nazis, which only prepared the way for the Cold War and subsequent conflicts, or monks who died in Scandinavia converting the Norse to Christianity. I mean, they both died in the cause of a strategy, but I think it's pretty clear that one strategy was a lot more successful than the other. And, we could look at the reconversion of Britain as well by Celtic missionaries. I think it's, we can make a fairly strong case that would work. Now, the other thing somebody might say is, well, if you look at Gandhi or King or anybody else, look, we were fighting against people who lived by the rule of law, Great Britain or the United States or whatever, not some totalitarian thugs. Well, the Soviet Union was totalitarian, okay, and that strategy did work. And then 2, that's often thrown up with regards to Hitler. But again, this was a country at war. The Soviet Union in 1990-91 was technically at peace, and also it was a political system that was the end of its life, and so it was easy to pressure it. So one to ask the relevant question, what would it have been like to pursue that kind of a strategy against the Nazi Europe in the 1980s that maybe had become dispirited or whatever, but at least was in a time of peace. And so war measures wouldn't really work. And you see, this is part of the strength of the Dove position. It's a game. It's a game. Well, it's a game of chicken. It's a bluff. So let's say that you engage in activities that are not strictly speaking illegal, or maybe tangentially illegal, that clearly disrupt the system, but are not. But the escalation that you have engaged in is not sufficient to merit a violent military crackdown where you shoot people in the streets, which is exactly what we saw in the 1989, 1990. And it's saying, okay, are you going to raise us? Are you going to really shoot us in the streets with all these cameras watching, the possibility of U.S. sanctions? And the Russians, the Soviet state, did not do that. It backed down. Because it's sort of fighting, it's fighting asymmetrically, right? You're not fighting the hawk where he's strongest. You're fighting him where he's weakest. And that was one of the arguments that Gene Sharp in his Dictatorship to Democracy was making as well. He's like, look, well, yeah, obviously, you're the people, you're powerless, you've been disarmed, you can't say, you just can't you can't directly resist the Red Army. You're going to get crushed. So you have to do these indirect methods, play to your strengths, not to his. And again, that does take knowing yourself and knowing your enemy. You have to know your enemy, that the totalitarian force has overwhelming military power, and a direct confrontation with that would be suicidal. And you also have to know yourself, knowing that what your strengths are. Another good example would be the Maori of New Zealand. Now, they did fight the British, but ultimately they succeeded where many other indigenous peoples failed because they were able to play the British-owned game. They figured out how the British legal system worked and then educated some of their own members to be lawyers to then use English law to their own benefit. And they were able to basically preserve much of their national identity in the face of British aggression. Because even though they could beat the British in individual battles over the short term, the resources the British Empire had were nearly limitless compared to these people. And if they continued to fight, they would have eventually been degraded through attrition to zero. And so again, that's being smart, right? You're playing on you're playing a judo throw where the enemy's like, well, yeah, those are our laws, those are our principles, and if you're going to appeal to those, we really can't violate them. And and again, maybe Genghis Khan rides into town. What's the smartest thing to do? Well, it's not to fight him because he'll leave your cities in ashes. It's to pay him off. And then your society will outlast his, because when the Mongol Empire is, just a distant memory, your city's probably still standing. So keep that in mind as well. So basically, as sort of a wrap up here, I think basically you can make a strong case on first principles and rationalistic pragmatism that a Dove policy is eminently reasonable. First is we can point to the fact that to win without fighting is the highest excellency in war, that in order to do that, you have to know yourself and know your enemy, which is a very hard thing to do. Self-knowledge is hard enough, let alone knowledge of somebody who your own emotions would cloud your judgment on, someone like your enemy. So it's going to take specific effort, mastery, hard work to get to the point where you can be that kind of a person. And as a broader strategy, you'd have to have organizations that raise people up to think and act like that so they can do it. We have from Lao Tzu the idea of soft beating the hard. So again, the medieval Christians versus the Vikings, a woman and a man, water and rocks. So we have that. We have different streams. Put yourself, through your own life decisions in a stream that is not going to put you up against impossible odds and violence and certain death. That doesn't mean you still might not be attacked, but you're doing the best that you can to minimize being attacked. Or to put it in the prepper's parlance, become a gray man. And a gray man, in short, is just somebody that people look over. They don't pay any attention. Even if they are looters and bandits, they just kind of look over you. You just blend in with the background. So there's that. Also, there are many situations in which the rational thing to do is not to fight, which a lot of realists and hawk proponents and people on the right fail to account for. And this can be backed up through numerous historical examples. There are obviously less historical examples, but there are historical examples of this sort of indirect Dove policy being successful against really serious odds that you wouldn't otherwise expect them to be successful on. And so, yeah. Now, again, what I'm not saying is that it's always going to work in every situation. There's no such strategy. And I'm not saying that you have to believe certain religious or philosophical principles to come to this conclusion. One might already have those and be predisposed to this in the first place, right? But you don't have to. You can, on reasonable grounds, hold to this position. And it is arguably easier to hold as an individual or a small group than a large group or a country. Though I think it could still be pursued in a more circumspect way. And then lastly, referring back to Egil's saga and Ehrenbjorn, the idea is that unless you have prior community commitments, again, based on religion or philosophy, I don't necessarily expect everybody to follow this. But I do expect there to be a sort of sense of societal respect for that person. Because even though Ehrenbjorn wasn't the harem-scarum writer that Egil was, his ability to smooth things over and negotiate and pull people out of tight spots was still respected by, the most hardened of warlords. So I would expect at least the fact that society or subcultures would respect them for the value that they offer to the situation. So what do we have in terms of super chats or chats? Well, let's see here. YouTube keeps crashing on you, Manon. Yeah, well, maybe that's the end of industrial society. Powers are going out, right? This is a good description of world theater. I'm not sure what you're referring to here. If If it was something I said earlier in the conversation. Let's see. Oh, self-aware. Here we go. Big brain content. That, like Plato, a regime has trouble finding other self-aware regimes and are doomed to be cornered into hodges. Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. Big brain content. I often think this is a concept of slow and soft overcoming hard and fast as physics and analogy of the progression of distance. Yeah. Well, that's exactly what we would see with like water breaking rocks or vines breaking rocks. It is these physical processes over time that break even the hardest substances. Let's see, you get physical representations where you can't get what you'd want to do to happen unless you consider the really slow and gradual. Yes. King. All right. Minoan for $10 US. Thank you. Much appreciated. Gandhi would have been toast if it were not for the Westerners being their overlords. Same with MLK. Not true. The Soviet Union was a ruthless totalitarian dictatorship. And yet, similar strategies were pursued in the Velvet Revolution by Václav Havel and by Lech Walesa in Poland. Let's see here. Here we go. Big brain content. I can't imagine a national regime picking a lifestyle that avoids needless violence without being threatened in doing so. Does that mean I'm blackpilled? Lol. It might, and you might be right. Like I said, it's really hard. I mean, a lot of things have to come into confluence for this to actually happen. Well, there are examples of it happening, and I think that proves the confluence. Let's see here. Manoan, I get what you're saying, but I think the situation will determine whether to be a hawk or a dove without one or the other gaining long-term dominance. I mean, that kind of depends. I mean, obviously, in order to deal with any given situation, you have to have overall strategies. So let's limit this to the question of violence. You have the Soviet military doctrine in World War II and the German military doctrine of World War II. You still have to stick to the doctrine, even if you have a multitude of different engagements. So the real question is, over the long run, which system yields better results, even if you might have individual disasters. And ultimately, as we saw in Eastern Europe, the Soviet model was able to win because I guess it could afford to take more hits to the face. Big brain content. This would require a culture of strategic thinking. Yeah, that's right. Exactly. That's what I'm talking about. Daily reminder to study Clausewitz as well. Exactly. Minoan, the Dove policy brings to mind the Jewish diaspora. They don't fight, but they never seem to keep a low profile. Is this a poor implement of the Dove policy? Well, yeah, okay. So what I would argue would be different, at least in the way that I'm constructing the policy, from the Jewish diaspora, is, as we well know, they tend to rob a lot of people the wrong way because that's what they when you have a lot of money, it's really easy to do that. Which is technically creating threats. And what they'll then do is they'll then use the United States as a puppet to do the fighting for them. What I would say is what I would see instead is a group that works on getting along with its neighbors such that it either doesn't get talked about at all because nobody really cares about it. I mean, think about like an ant, right? Humans won't attack you or try to poison you if they don't care about you or they like you. So I think that's it. Big brain content. The way Todd just described the conversion of the Vikings sounds like the judo of the will. Yeah. I mean, again, it doesn't matter if you're, Thorfinn Skullsplitter with a two-handed sword. Your side still loses. So, I mean, there you go. Big brain content. These dark hawk magicians seem to seek a peace via floating above seer of war in a foreign land instead of simply a desert or a pyramid of skulls. Floating above seer water. Yeah, they never follow through. That's kind of their issue here. Yes, okay, big brain content. Yes, the hawk scope is too narrow. Yeah, exactly. And I think what they do is they kind of like prejudice the scenarios in mind in order to make their position look better than it really is. What would you say to a foe who is hell-bent on destroying you like the China and the Uyghurs? Well, yeah, fighting like hell wouldn't really work against China. We can see an analogous example with the Central Asian Muslims in the 20s and 30s. They tried to fight for independence against the Red Army and got squished. Ultimately, yeah, that's an interesting question. Like Genghis Khan just wants you to pay the tribute and he'll move on. What do you do with somebody who doesn't do that? Well, I mean, I guess that depends on a variety of factors, because in a situation like China versus the Uyghurs, or maybe even the Turks against the Greeks, like Mustafa Kemal, well, the Greeks left, right? So Smyrna was sacked in 1923 and they fled to Greece proper. I think we're in that situation, if at all possible, emigration is the really only viable solution. Unless you could have another larger power intervene on your behalf. Big brain content. The dove analogy is pretty interesting, especially thinking about doves among doves in the absence of a hawk. Yeah. The other thing too, well, yeah, so here's the thing, right? A lot of these thought experiments assumes that there's more hawks than there are. But this is a biological example, remember? And in any sort of biosphere, apex predators are the minority in the population. So if we view human actors, say state actors or corporate actors, as apex predators, they're in the minority of the population, so most of the time you're not dealing with them. So most of the time it is a dove-dove relationship. And if it's just you, the individual, versus a big corporate state entity, then you're going to be crushed. Dove is a good way to survive in that case too. Or as I said, be in a stream where the never the twain shall meet, in as much as you can actually make that happen. And I think another thing with the hawks, it's a framing device. They frame it in a certain way that it looks very plausible and it's workable. But if you go outside of the narrow biases, it becomes, you see the flaws. The other thing is, the United States wants to portray itself as a dove when it's really a hawk, and that propaganda started to break down in the war on terror. But there is this, but part of the strength of the United States up until recently was this sort of goodwill that the world had for it because it was perceived as a dove. So that is partly a defensive strategy. So one could envision, with my Tolstoy example, a Tolstoy in Russia would be a Russia that everybody would love because it's a dove, and therefore would have a lot of international credibility, which itself is a defense mechanism. Let's see. Record deepness. Could the breakdown of Austria-Hungary be seen as a result of their abandonment of a dove policy? Well, that is interesting, right? Obviously, once they committed to World War I, all bets are off. There was, I remember watching this sort of like imaginary reenactment of a sermon by John Wesley, and he said that once one unscabbards the sword of war, one never knows where it ends up. So Austria-Hungary kind of put itself in a position where it didn't really know where it was going after that point. I think the problem with Austria was in a period of transition, right? Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated precisely because he was going to extend political representation to the Slavic elements of Austria-Hungary, and Serbia didn't want that to happen. So as far as like an internal policy, Austria-Hungary was seemingly on the path to a more conciliatory policy to its minority populations. But it did, respond in kind with Serbia, escalating the conflict to the point where it would lose the war inevitably. Big brain contact. Great stream. I am loving this format. Well, I'm glad you are. Thanks, sir, for tuning in, and make sure to tell others to tune in as well. Minoan. I seem to be a natural hawk, but your talk has given me much to consider, and a dovish tactic looks better than it did. Well, that was kind of the point, Minoan. That was kind of the point. Was the U.S. ever a dove? No, I just said it likes to be perceived as a dove. The U.S. likes to portray itself as the peaceful person in the room, and it's had a very effective PR doing that. But actual fact, it's not very dovish at all. So yeah, everybody, thanks for tuning in. I'm glad the stream was informative and educational and entertaining for all concerned. Don't forget to, again, like, share, and subscribe, hit the notification bell. Check me out on Locals. And tune in next time. It's Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.